Good evening. My name is Mark Harris, and I'm the host for DiversiTV. Tonight's show, the inaugural show, is the Native Perspective. And the reason that we're starting with natives is because we are on Turtle Island, and it is part of the way of my ancestors to acknowledge the people that were there before you. And so we have a distinguished panel of guests drawn from the local Native community. Starting on screen left, we have Sardin Riddle. Gordon Bettles will be joining us, hopefully, shortly. Sardin Riddle is a student. Emilio Hernandez is the U of O Assistant Vice Provost for Institutional Equity and Diversity. Cruz Morton was a student at LCC, and James Florendo, the LCC Natives Program Coordinator. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
You can remove your stoic looks now. We were joking off camera before we started about, oh, everybody looks stoic now. While there are many questions, do you guys have anything to say? Should I just start with coordinating questions?
Questions.
Questions?
Coordinate.
All right.
Coordinate away.
Generally speaking, if you want to look at what does it mean to be native in the 21st century, if you could formulate or answer and ask that question, which might involve issues of cultural survival, sovereignty, different forms of sovereignty, whose model of sovereignty are we using, the native indigenous model or the white European model adapted to native model, which may or may not give us interesting questions. And I remember a poster in a local store basically featuring an Aztec warrior who basically was captioned, "Who's the illegal immigrant, Pilgrim?" So what do you think, gentlemen? Issues of what does it mean to be native in the 21st century?
We're going out of order here? Or?
Yes,
All
any
right.
order.
I'll go. I think that it's a constant survival game. You have to live life to survive, I guess, in society by their rules. The people who wrote, the people who conquered, people who wrote the history books. We have to go play by their rules. But I think that every day that we play by those rules, we realize how much we want to get back to where we were. You know, go back to the old ways that were working better for us, and we're not, you know, trading our services for paper that's got numbers printed on it, or, you know, giving up our morals to get in better standing so we can have a nicer car or better clothes or stuff like that. You know, why play by the rules that are obviously not working for a lot of people in this country, you know, but then again, if you decide to go back to something like that, then you're once again ousted. So every day is a challenge to even survive the way you want to, the way you were raised by your grandparents, by your parents. And you come into this type of lifestyle and it's uncomfortable.
It gets into the question of, okay, tradition, the way it was, and today's reality. Anyone else?
I'll just piggyback onto that in regards to an educational perspective that is nationwide right now. As we were talking before we started this whole thing about an incident that's occurred at Dartmouth in regards to how that program is to considered a premier Native American program across the country. Stanford used it as their model. However, in the last month, there was issues there on campus in regards to very racist articles in their conservative paper, articles around. There was actually the cover showed a native caricature with a scalp in his hand, and the topic on top of it said, "The natives are getting restless." What this all came about from was that the native students on the campus at Dartmouth were very concerned with the way they were being treated, not only because of the mascot issue, which is continuing to go around the country, but just as natives being on that campus, they were seen as outsiders. What that whole thing led to was a protest, including faculty, staff, and the native students on campus. And the writers of the article, the drawing of the caricature said that The main aim was to look at the fact that the Native American students were playing the race card too much. It wasn't about the race card. It wasn't about them looking at the drawing on the paper. They said people reacted to it wrongly. We wanted them to look at the fact that natives were playing the race card too much on that campus. Now, having been in education, in the State Board of Education here in Oregon for 9 years, and working at the University of Oregon now, this race card issue with Native American populations, ironically, has just grown out of control because, as any other thing else happens, when people start to speak out, become more in numbers, graduating more of Native Americans and going into the job market, that's the new target.
And playing the race card, often when I hear that phrase, especially when it's applied, well, to African Americans most of the time, right? One could ask the question, well, who minted the deck? That's one. That created the race, the deck of cards of which the race card is a part. And then, is the race card an ace or trump card, or is it a joker that is ineffective? And who decides when that is, and who decides, when it is, when the race card is being played?
It's amazing to me that whenever a person of color speaks up, they're playing the race card. But if for some reason somebody of a European descent is feeling like they're being picked on or what have you, we're not saying, oh, they're playing the blank card, or the lack of color card or the white card. It's always the race card with these people. Right. It's just like if somebody of color steps up and says, I don't like this, I don't want this to happen, why can't you respect us? It's always the race card. And you know what? The only person who ever brings that issue up are the people that want something else to happen. If they're Caucasian, know that they're playing the race card because the Indians are not happy and they're getting restless and da 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 da.
Or those blacks are always talking about racism.
But yeah,
or whatever,
yeah. And then, like I said, if it's Billy Thompson from Sheboygan, Wisconsin, we're not saying he's playing the blank card or the white card. He just gets to bitch about it and nothing is said.
It is interesting about this convention, since this is happening in mostly the English language, where we talk about, for example, you go to the store, the ethnic food section, and who's in the ethnic food section, and it's usually not where you find white bread and mayonnaise.
And Twinkies. You gotta forget the Twinkies.
And it's usually, who's defining what is ethnic, and how come white is not an ethnicity, and how come white is not a race in the race card. And we'll be actually talking about that kind of discussion next week when we do white folks. But for this discussion, in terms of, that is one of the issues that definitely affects us in Indian country in terms of looking at how we think about things, who's framing the discussion. Anyone else?
Just in trying to stay with the same analogy, I think it's really for a lot of Native people, it's whether you choose to sit at the table and play the cards. I believe that you don't necessarily need to, that speaking from a sovereign base or a sovereign thought, you always look at whoever you're discussing anything with on not necessarily an equal level, but a respectful level, where there is no advantage either way, there is no right or wrong either way, but you approach your dialogue as a sovereign person. I know that you're doing this, but this is what I'm going to do. I'll respect what you're going to do, but you have to respect what I have to do, because I'm a sovereign nation. I think a lot of Native people have forgot to think that way. They think they've become caught up in the card game, playing the game that white America wants them to play. And for me, all white America, or the capitalist American system, not necessarily all white people, is just another value system. And I think in my opinion, working with Native students for close to 20 years, that the biggest thing that I see is them learning that if they have them already, that their cultural values are what they should be basing their decisions on, rather than some values that are given to them by the American society that just don't work within our culture. And to me, it's always been the biggest challenge for a lot of Native students. I was fortunate enough to grow up on a reservation and to be instilled with those values. And even today, I still find in very personal, controversial ideas in my head that I'm always going to reflect back on my grandmas, my grandpas, my uncles, my aunties, the things that they said to make a decision about whatever it is that's bothering me, and rather than an academic one or an economic one, or you know, to me, like Cruz said, you know, we're in a constant battle of survival, and it was the same in the past. Only in the past it was an occasional bear, wolf, mountain lion. Now it's, you know, corporate America. You just got to know what's there, accept it for what it is, deal with it or don't, and live your life the way that you want to. Again, that to me is coming from a sovereign base, where you choose to live the way that you want to because you know you can, rather than what people are inferring that you should live, or the styles and values you should hold.
Sandon.
Well, to me, I didn't grow up on a reservation. I grew up in Eugene, which isn't the most widely the largest representation of Native people, or people of color for that matter. And I didn't grow up with my community so much around me. So it has been a pretty big struggle to try to maintain my culture, especially since a lot of the elders in the community, this many generations away from contact, there was a point when if you tried to speak your language, you were beaten, and if you tried to practice your culture, you were killed. So a lot of that went underground and was lost. So I try to keep as much of my identity as I can and always discover more parts of it by talking to elders. And recently I was in DC looking up the history of the Oregon tribes through a Smithsonian and University of Oregon research project. So that showed me a lot about the will of the Native people to survive, and I don't know, just to keep their culture. And I do my best to keep the culture, but it's hard when you're raised in a culture that doesn't teach your history. It teaches someone, you know, the victor's version of history. That the natives were going off and doing all these wild things and they had to be suppressed, when really the attacks that were happening were like slaughters and massacres of like women and children in villages to try to destroy the culture and the people. So I'm always struggling to maintain my identity, but once you do manage to find your culture and integrate with the people in your community, it's a great deal of help. So basically, I guess being Native in the 21st century to me is a struggle.
How do you define sovereignty? I mean, because a number of you have touched upon that in terms of cultural survival, and you've talked about the theme about trying to maintain your culture under battle conditions, when your culture may or may not have evolved in battle conditions originally, I mean, pre-contact. How do you reform your culture to maintain, well, first define sovereignty, what does that mean? And then how do you maintain a culture, and what does that look like when you begin to express it?
It seems like a trick question to me. I mean, we maintain because we are. If I want to seek knowledge, then I go to an elder, or I go to, you know, my mother, my father, grandparent, or another elder, or someone who's been there and experienced more than I have. It's not so much as keeping sovereignty. I don't know, it's just, that word doesn't make any sense to me. It's not the way we live. It's not the way we are, you know? I mean, I'm half Mexican and half Indian, so, and on both sides, it's about keeping family close, keeping family listening to what the elders have to say when they have to say it, respecting them, treating them. Years ago, I was on security, and I was at the fair, and there was a family that walked by, and there were about 6 or 7 people, and the kids were screaming and running around and looking at this, that, and the other thing, and the parents were screaming and yelling, "Get back here, don't touch that, da, da, da." And the grandma and the grandpa were in the back, and they were trailing along with this, sad face. And then not 10 seconds later, this family of color comes walking up, and grandma and grandpa are in the lead. And actually grandma's standing is one step further than grandpa, and the kids are not doing anything. It's not out of fear, though, it's out of respect. The family is together, grandma is taking the lead, will do what she wants to do, It's just the way it is. There's no trying to keep it, you keep it. You raised that way, you're taught that way, you meet friends that way, you celebrate that way. You don't try, you just do.
Home training, my grandmother would call it.
Mm-hmm.
There you go.
I think sovereignty is a little easier for me to speak to. My tribe is one of the tribes in Oregon. It's never been terminated. It's never been reinstated. It's always been a sovereign nation. I do know what it means, and it does mean something. And I think listening to Cruz speaks to a lot of the issues that Native people need to face, that they need to understand what that is. And it's a legal term that this government made a legal agreement with nations in this country to be respected as sovereign nations, to stand-alone nations, that you have the right to do whatever you choose to do on your land, in your tribe, the way you want to do it. And it's like France or Germany or Italy or any of those countries. Now, yes, here you have to learn to live within a country, just like any other country. You have to learn to live with whoever you're next to. But a sovereign nation is always going to know who they are, know what they want, know where they're going, and not necessarily have to trade off anything to get anything. There's no part of my culture that I need to give up to become an American. I am an American, and I'm also mixed blood, but I was raised with a notion to know who I am and to be proud of it, and to be able to, like I said earlier, to be able to negotiate from that level. You don't give away any power. You are an equal power, and you talk that way. You approach things that way. You don't look at yourself as either superior or inferior, because you know that what you're going to do is what you as a tribe want to do.
I think those issues of sovereignty are a big reflection on our educational system and our media system. Media has conditioned our younger folks to look at news as one-day news. What happened in the paper today happened today. And that's it. Our historical memory plays into the hands of what government, educational systems, majority race, whatever you want to point it at, plays into their way of looking at sovereignty. If you go back and look at all the broken treaties and all the different issues that have been taken away, as James referred to, the tribes that supposedly didn't exist, and then all of a sudden you became an Indian again, our educational system has not addressed those issues. I mean, how many times has anybody in this room heard a student from high school to a university setting say, "Why do I have to pay for what I didn't do? I didn't kill those Indians. My grandparents didn't kill those Indians." There's that short-term memory that does not play into reality of what natives are to this country. And that's the hardest part for me as an educator and as an advocate for Native American rights and education, is that this short-term memory just does not play well with what we have to face up as a country, what was done to all those tribes, all those treaties, all those killings, all these demonstrations that are continuing now, this race card issue, the natives are getting restless. Those kinds of things we allow young folks to say because there is no memory there for them of what their ancestors did. And as educators and as community members, we have to look at this whole process as a whole. We cannot simply take and expect the elders to take this on their own. Everyone has to step up as a community and work together to refresh, if you will, this lack of memory that's all of a sudden lapsed into our society. With all this technology, with everything that we have at our access, boom, we forgot. I wasn't part of that. Why should I care what happens to James? And that's the way these young folks are thinking these days. And it's detrimental to the whole society as a whole as to how we're going to work around this whole issue of everybody's races.
I think I agree with Emilio in that it's detrimental to society, but I think I see it in another way also. I agree with what he's saying, but I tend to see Native sovereignty being a statement of worldview, one that includes the things that Cruz has talked about, family, community, environment, that are inherent in our values if you were brought up with them. And it's what a lot of Native students who were not brought up that way, as Sandin is finding out, as he connects up with Natives in the community, he gets more of a sense of what community is, more a sense of what grandmas and grandpas are and elders are, and the importance of the environment around them to them, and it draws you in. It becomes much more inclusive, and to me, that's what sovereignty is all about, being able to believe that regardless of all the negatives that are going around with Native people, because since the landing of the first ship from Europe, you know, it's been a downhill slide. And tribes can choose to ally with the colonizers. They can fight the colonizers. They can live alongside the colonizers. And as sovereign nations, they're allowed to do whatever they please. A way, I think one of the, I was listening to Charles Wilkinson, who is a lawyer who's dealt a lot with Native American issues in the United States, well-renowned speaker and lawyer, and I went to hear a speech by him, and he said, sovereignty is really the rights for Natives to make their own decisions, right or wrong. If they're wrong, that's for them to learn to make it right. Again, you do have several different, in the U.S. you have several different levels of awareness of culture, traditions, and values. You have Natives who've never left the reservations. You have Natives who've never been on a reservation, and everything in between, and an entire mix of all those values and beliefs. And what's bad about it is that I think America and the world in general are really shortcutting themselves if they don't listen to what Native people have to say in terms of family, environment, and community, and the way that Natives have always lived in harmony with all of those. And if you take a look at the environmental state of the world, we're in pretty dire straits because of all of those reasons. And if we'd learn to do that again, and learn to look to the people that have that knowledge, I think a lot could be learned. But again, it's the educational system that chooses not to teach it.
Sandin.
Well, for me, I think sovereignty is an important thing because I know that, and I think of my people as being the original inhabitants of, like, of this state of Oregon. But I know with my tribe and with tribes that, like, people who are Indian, but they're not recognized, like, I kind of feel about it, and this might just be like me growing up and not, like, I don't know how to explain that, but that it's the government saying, okay, we'll let you be a tribe, and because we'll give you this much and say you can't do this. And, like, I think at this point we haven't no one's pushed the boundaries to the point where they, like in the past, where they've had to revoke the treaty rights or do this, because there is that conflict between, I mean, some of the tribes get along pretty well, but with my tribe, there's been like murders down in Klamath Falls over the water rights issue. And like, like with certain tribes, we'll respect these things to a point. And like, and also the thing with like needing an identity card. Like some people really like it because like it like gives, I guess it secures their identity. But for me, at this point, I don't have one just because even though it's kind of set up within the tribe, I kind of feel as if it's the government like making me prove that I'm Indian, like based on one of their, like a plastic card that's from their culture, like imposed upon our culture. And so one of the things I feel the worst about is those people who like know they're native inside, like for instance the Wintu, like who aren't a tribe recognized, or I don't know. The tribes that vanished, even though the people were still there, you know. But it's kind of my take on it.
What you're talking about in terms of illuminating the history that isn't necessarily taught unless you're in ethnic studies, or unless you find it for yourself. I mean, because one of the issues you've talked about, because several of you have referenced the elders. Well, what if there are no elders that have the history, or the elders that you have are raised in boarding school, don't have the history or the language or the roots to the culture? What is it you do? When we're talking about, for example, the race card, well, who mints the deck? And if you talk about card games being like gambling, well, if you've gambled, you understand that the house always wins, or just lets you win enough to keep playing the game. In this case, the house is the White House, pun intended, okay? Who, when we talk about, for example, can you go to the graphic on PowerPoint? All right, so as an example, the ancient name for this land, whether rendered into a number of languages, but I'm using for this particular slide Tulipit Wapa Kisinep, which is defined in Winterhawk's book, Circular Thinking, as the long-reaching land, also known as Turtle Island. And basic graphic is a sea turtle. And Cruz was talking about, it's interesting how Native people define this land as something that's alive, that's living. So you have the back of a sea turtle, and the graphic on the sea turtle is what is referred to in English as North and South America. So if you think of Turtle Island being North and South America, then the basic image, the idea behind Turtle Island is one land, many nations, no borders. So people will have their ancestral territory that they've occupied for thousands of years, and you'll have people, for example, the southern tip of South America who don't have fire, and then you'll have people who build pyramid cities in Mexico, and Cahokia, another pyramid city. Not that that is a mark of civilization having a city, but we have a whole range of cultures and technologies and practices, and that if sovereignty means anything in the sense that James is talking about, it means self-determination and self-definition, so that you're a nation. So depending on who tells the story, there were either, and I like to go at the high end, 150 million Native people before contact. White folks like to say, well, only 60, because that tends to make them look better. That makes the genocide. We all, that makes the genocide, reducing it from 60 to 3 or 4 million, from 150 to 3 or 4 million makes them look better. So who decides who is a legitimate nation? Of the 500 recognized tribes, why are they recognized, and why is the federal government recognizing them and not recognizing others? Sometimes there are tribes that have state recognition but not federal recognition. There are some tribes that have both. Who decides that? And also the language of tribe. If, as James pointed out, your legal status is that of Germany or France, then those people aren't referred to as tribes. tribes in the English language denotes less civilized than the civilized, who turns out to be white. So one of the things that we look at when we're playing this game of words, sovereignty is a tricky concept, because whose definition are we using? Whose words are we using? And so when we look at Tulipitwapakisanap, the idea of no borders, this idea of, okay, being mixed blood, where did we get that idea? And how did we get the idea of south of the border when Turtle Island didn't have borders? Whose concept was that? And so we talk about, the fact that we are having to deal with multiple thoughts on multiple levels, often at cross purposes. We've accepted some of the ideas of the colonizer, and that has been part of our problem, especially accepting a model of sovereignty which doesn't include everybody, when our models of sovereignty did include everybody, period, end of discussion. Whether you're two-spirited or what the English refer to as gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, blah, 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 when you have women who could be at the center of power. When we talk about short memory, because I don't want to monopolize this, I want your comments, please. Short memory, when we're talking about only the history of America instead of the history of Turtle Island, and short vision into the future. When Six Nations talks about not making decisions unless you consider 7 generations away, 140 years, not the next economic quarter, 3 months away. So it's not just short cultural amnesia, lack of memory, or long enough memory, it's also lack of vision that takes care of everybody. Your thoughts?
From a sovereign viewpoint, who defines sovereignty is the sovereign nation. I do. I don't care if Sandon doesn't have a card. I don't care if Cruz is south of the border and Emilio or your tribes are from an American government's border. I've learned in the 20 years that I've worked with students that you're going to meet every kind of Indian in the world, and the best way that I can relate with them and the best way for them to relate with me is for me to accept them for who they are, regardless of what the federal government defines them as. And that's what I mean about thinking as a sovereign nation. I think all Native people need to think that way. You need to think of yourself that way. You don't need to qualify yourself with a card or any other nation's definition of who you are. A tribe is a nation. That's what sovereignty defines it as in the legal context. And if Sandon's Klamath Modoc, then he's Klamath Modoc to me. All he has to do is say so. You are who you are. I accept that because I accept who I am. I accept my position as a sovereign nation, and so should you. And who defines it? I define it.
You don't go up to another Indian and say, if he says he's from a certain tribe, you don't say, prove it. I want to see your coat of arms that says you're from this tribe. You say, I'm Apache and Chumash. And you don't need proof. You don't need the card. It's live in Indian. You live it. You live what you say you are.
I think that's really critical. And again, when you get back to values, I think that's a real difference in a lot of Natives' awareness of who they are. That, like you were saying earlier, being raised up properly. Okay, if you were raised up with the values, regardless of whether you were on a reservation or in a city, an Indian's going to know you're an Indian by the way you act, by the way you take them into your home, by the way that you feed them, by the way that you give them a glass of water when they're thirsty. Very simple things. It may be understating some things, but I think that's the simplicity of the value system of Native people. Instead of over-intellectualizing everything, just move back to the basics of humanity, and you'll find Indians there.
What? I don't know, I'm just thinking about it. Well, no, like when I do, yeah, I did agree with that. My thing is just on how the mainstream society views Natives and how it's taught to other people, because that does affect natives when they're trying to survive. And if you have mascots parading around, like Chief Alainuek, saying, "Oh, we're respecting you by doing this," by having this mascot with a fictional dance, and who's never been played by an Indian. It was played by a Mexican once, I think, but that's about as close
to Indian as you got.
Yeah.
I don't think a real Indian would do it. I think he would just be like, no, thank you.
Well, I don't know. Both the Utah Utes and the Seminole, Florida tribes have agreed with those schools for them to allow to use their name. And I know the Seminoles got tuition for their kids out of it. So there's ways to negotiate this stuff, and I have to respect that. Whether I agree with it or not, it's like, to me, the Oglala Nation, or the Oglala Nations, Lakota Nations, Dakota Nations fighting with, is it North Dakota?
Yeah.
The Fighting Sioux. And I'm going, they're not even Sioux. You know, they're Lakota, they're Nakota, they're Dakotas. They know who they are, and let this school be idiot about misnaming whoever they're misnaming. You know, they're the ones that are looking bad. If they're being so insistent on misrepresenting themselves, they'll sell themselves out of existence as a school. No one's going to want to go there in an intelligent society. And I say that with a little tongue in cheek. Yeah, I'm hoping that we're moving to an intelligent society. We've got all the technology to share the information. I don't think, again, some of the gatekeepers are allowing all the information to get out there correctly. But to Native people, if we work with one another, I think we'll be okay. We've survived this long, and I think we're going to continue to survive.
I think another layer to the whole issue that brings concern to me is the biracial and multiracial youth. Those that don't have the tones of skins that are up here, that are lighter skinned, that have to carry this card or prove, as you were saying. You hear this in schools where we were working on the Indian education plan years ago at the Department of Education. You would hear it in schools from the principals and teachers saying, well, we don't have any Indians in our class, so why should we teach this? Well, it was their eyes making the judgment, and little did they know that there was biracial kids in their classroom that were natives. And it gets back to what James was saying, is self-identity at that point really becomes crucial for a young person. Who am I and who's going to tell me what I am? Do I have to carry this card? Do I go to my nation and become that, even though I don't look like everybody else from my tribe? We have to understand, as Cruz was saying, if I say I'm this Indian from this tribe, then the belief is in that person's word. But we're seeing a lot of young folks that are, for lack of a better term, negating their own heritage because they don't look, they don't know their own culture, their own tribal history. I mean, if anybody had suffered as much as the natives have over the history of time, the spirituality that the natives that I have seen in all the tribes, anybody would reach out to as many different directions as they could to hold themselves together as a family, as a tribe, as an individual. But now we've got this mix of races, and if we don't get these young folks in and gather them up, in a sense, and let them know who they are and that they can be proud of what they are, we're going to lose a whole nother generation of young folks that are going to be very confused.
I think it goes clear across the board, not just with natives and people of color. I think it sweeps right across white America. It's, to me, the big reason why America's in the trouble it is, because they don't know who the heck they are. Their entire traditions, values, knowledge of who they are, where they come from, has been totally erased and covered up with an socioeconomic facade that says you need to make this to get this. And they've bought into it. And We all have to a certain degree for survival purposes, but the way that you use the money you make, whether it's for a new SUV or whether it's to bring your grandma and grandpa home to meet with your grandchildren at Christmas, is a decision that you can make as a human being. And I'm not saying that all white America doesn't do that, but a great majority of them have bought into the whole Christmas rush. All you got to do is look at a newspaper right after the day after Thanksgiving, and then the day after Christmas, see all the sales that they're still pumping and pushing for afterwards, and you can see where that whole Christian celebration has gone and where this nation has allowed it to go, because they have lost the value of humanity behind even Christianity.
One of the things that, or several of the themes that you brought up about card-carrying Indians and who decides who carries the card, membership has its privileges.
If you want to believe that, membership, I mean, honestly, I have friends that are card-carrying Indians, and the only time they bring them out is when, you're at Crazy Horse National Monument. You can get in for free. Boy, that card's out there, If you want your... it's just like, okay, it's time to divide up the salmon or the buffalo. Hey, there's my card, But any other time, it's just another card in your wallet, It's not. I don't think that like membership has its privileges too much. It's just like, hey, if I can get in free with just showing this guy this card, then I'm gonna do it. Any of us would, because that's just the way that it is.
Well, I guess if you think of it as another form of race card,
Yeah.
and who is making the race card and to what end?
Then that's true, because I do carry a card, and I'm proud of it, and I got it from my tribe. I didn't get it from anybody else, and it feels real good to be a member of a tribe, to know that I'm acknowledged as such. I have 5 children, and 4 of them are enrolled, and the last one, the youngest, is not. And through our tribe's regulations, she can't get enrolled. Yes, our tribe has their own rules, and I may not agree with them, but she felt very much different, very devastated, very not like her brothers, because she didn't have a card. And I had to reassure her, babe, you can dance, you can speak, you grew up with your grandma, you take care of your nieces and nephews, you're part of this family. Everybody at home on the res knows you're Indian, even if you don't have a card, okay? But yeah, it does for her, just that little card, and knowing that you are an acknowledged part of a group is a big thing. And yes, it is pretty devastating to some Indians who don't have it. And again, if you define it in sovereign terms, okay, then it can go either way, and it can be all right either way, because it's your choice not for it to matter, or it can be your choice for it to matter. And it's your right to, and I respect that right as a sovereign person. And
Sandon.
Well, to me, I think the thing about that is, I think a lot of tribes have kind of been tricked by the regulations. I mean, because through the various things, if it's per capita or the different benefits, to restrict their membership. I mean, like by either having like blood quantum as opposed to direct descendancy. Because I think the American government would at some point like to have a point where they could say, well, there's no Native Americans we'd have to deal with. And I think, well, I wish sovereignty was something that didn't have to be in legal terms, and that the wider culture had a greater understanding of who we are as a people and as nations and as like the keepers of this land. And I think that's a ways off, but what has to happen is we have to change the master narrative and have to get our history in there and have to get that out there, which is going to be with the internet, hopefully, and the various ways of technology, we'll be able to take back that control of our history. But yeah.
I think the master narrative, though, actually has to start with us, within us, in terms of where sovereignty starts within us. I've been encouraged, and I'm making this distinction because we're talking in English, and you have to make the distinction based on how people look. Okay, so I started out defining myself as a black Indian, and basically was at a conference of other black Indians, and we're making that distinction not because we're less or more Indians than quote-unquote red Indians, but that the distinction has been made in terms of tribes, nations, defining sovereignty and determining citizenship within their nations based on blood quantum. So I would assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, James, that your daughter, your biological daughter, is being excluded because of a concept based on blood quantum and essentially being, the dilute blood. So just to talk about this, to see it in the visual, can you go to slide for a second? All right, so one of the things about being African is we got to define our history and the history of people with us and noticing where things came from. Before contact, Native people, African people did not define citizenship in a nation by blood quantum. White people don't even decide citizenship by blood quantum. So this model, this blood quantum model, was actually devised from horse breeding. All right? So in the Conference of Black Indians, which is the first time that I actually heard this articulated, here's the model, okay? Arabian war horses, which were bred by black Africans to go into battle. They understood a vocabulary of up to 100 words, spoken commands, being able to go into battle with guns, swords, etc., hand-fed in houses, extremely intelligent, very willful. That's what extremely intelligent means. All right? And so that if you get on one, you better have its respect, and it better know that it respects you, because it will throw you, right? So this willful tendency had to be bred out, and that's why you have quarter horses. So what you have is the stamina and the strength of an Arabian without the intelligence, right? That's why you have quarter Arabian horses. So that idea, breeding horses, was used by Thomas Jefferson, okay, in two different ways, both against people of color. So go to slide for a second. On the left side, I know it's hard to see this, but applied to First Nations, the idea of racial purity. Like you can have racial purity. We're all human beings. So we're all human beings, we're all pure human beings. So applied to First Nations, the federal government defines 1/8 Indian for the purpose of removing tribal land rights. So that even in the most liberal blood quantum, like the Cherokee, 1/16, maybe 1/32, but usually 1/8. The idea was that in 2 generations there would in fact be no Native Americans. You'd be gone, legally. All right? On the right side, applied to black people, the so-called one-drop rule. All right? Where you have 1/64. So if one of your great-great-great-great-grandparents was full-blooded African, you were defined as black. Now, bear in mind, the half-breed, okay, Lakota called them Iska, which meant trader, like trading stuff, not a person who betrayed you, though it is sometimes used that way. And black, mulatto, a first-generation black-white mix. Now, the Indian term, the indigenous Taino word, is maroon. First-generation native African mix, and it's a term of respect. Mulatto is not necessarily a term of respect, neither is Iska. So half-breed black people are mulatto. Quarter, black, quadroon. 1/8, that's the federal Indian cutoff. Blacks apply octoroon. And then 1/16, the Cherokee cutoff. And then so forth. And 1/32, well, you're not Indian. 1/64, one-drop rule, the minimum Southern qualification to be black. That is, you could be blonde hair and blue-eyed with the first mulatto generation. You could be. Whatever shows up in the genetic dice can be expressed right there. But if you have one drop, then you're black. And so the idea was to deny access to legal rights, okay? Because black blood is not stronger than native blood. So many Indian tribes have accepted this notion and basically even taken it farther to say it's better to mix with Europeans and consider blonde-haired, blue-eyed sovereign and not to mix with blacks and Mexicans because that pollutes you. All right? So this whole blood quantum was basically devised by, the White House to divide us. We have about 5 minutes, so let's continue with this and maybe some parting shots, if you will, or last thoughts.
I think, again, the whole blood quantum thing is a socioeconomic thing put on the White House, where you end up making tribes, if you know who is Abramoff, his antics, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, their antics, they did come under suit, I believe, for mismanagement of all the monies that's supposed to go to Native people, which means that not much of it was getting to the Native people. So you got rights that were written in law of health, happiness, education, welfare, that kind of health, welfare, education, that kind of thing, but no money to provide it, and a government that wants to do what you're saying, just terminate. They tried it. They terminated tribes, saying, "Oh, you're not even Indian anymore, whether you're half-blood, full-blood, whatever," and sent you off to the city and said, "Now you're an American." They found out that didn't work, and then they thought, all right, these people got their act together enough to display the fact that they knew their traditions, their values, their families, their ways, the recognition, a connection to the land that wherever they were, to be reinstated. And now it still continues to be a fight over limited resources, even within the tribes. It came out of my daughter. Gee, I don't get a per capita. I don't get a bonus. Well, you don't need to be Indian. That, it's just a part of the little economic gain that our tribe made, but it's also something that the government has put on everybody. And to me, you'll find some tribes that have very rigid blood quantum rules that they set. The federal government allows you to set them, but I think you're very much correct in the fact that, it's a way that they're trying to not have to pay us anymore for what they told us they were going to pay us to do.
So, 30 seconds each? Got about 2 minutes.
How do you follow that,
Right.
No, the only thing that I want to say is before any Anglo-Saxon Bob Thomas from Sheboygan, Wisconsin gets us all tied in a knot over what we've been saying here, when I'm thinking of white America and the white man and everything like that, it's not Europe. It's that 5% that make the rules with all their money. They can be black, they can be white, they can be Mexican, they can be Indian. Those are the ones that's the boot heel on the neck for us. It's those ones. Not all white people are bad. I even have some white friends, so, I don't want anyone getting all bent over it. It's just, we're not saying all white people are bad. Don't.
Some of my best friends are
Yeah, some of my best friends are white, and gay. So white and gay, and they're good to go.
Emilio and Sardin?
Very quickly, I think this whole thing just ties into this whole historical perspective of the manifest destiny. And it's still continuing to this day. Angela Davis was here last weekend, and she spoke about how that is still being an issue of what's going on in this country, and I think that's needs to be brought back into the history books now.
Yeah. Sardin?
Well, I just hope that we get more teachers out there, like Native teachers, to be able to teach our history, and also to teach the history, also to help with the big immigration thing that's going on right now, because it just doesn't make sense to me how someone who was here maybe 200 years ago, like their family came over, like, and that's going back a ways for some of the families here. But could tell someone whose family was maybe a little bit south, or maybe even was from like California, that you're an immigrant, or you're a legal immigrant, when their family's been there maybe 8,000 to 10,000 years.
So tune in next week. This has been the inaugural show of DiversiTV, Native Perspective. Tune in next week for what I term as the cool white people, where we will look at what does white culture look like when it's not racist, sexist, homophobic. See you next week. Thank you for listening and watching.